I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, I'm not going to do a second presentation. We've got a pretty packed schedule as it is, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes, literally. This morning I promised I'd just give thumbnail sketches on metals in generally and some of the metals specifically. I'll just run through that very, very quickly. Gold. I still think before the year's over, we're going to see a move in the gold price. It really is going to come down to, us seeing a shift to negative interest rates again, which I'm hoping is going to happen later this year. I mean, there's two ways for that to happen. Either yields back off a bit, or we see inflation increase. I don't expect much of an inflation increase, but we don't need much of one to turn things negative again. I think the hawkishness that people heard in the initial testimony by Jerome Powell, the new Fed chief in the U.S., I think people might have been reading a little too much into that because the market suddenly decided we were going to have 4 or more rate increases this year. I'm not convinced that's going to happen the way the market's been reacting to things. I suspect New York is going to put a scare into us 2 or 3 times again before this year's out. And I think that's going to keep the Fed from getting too aggressive, which is going to help gold. Silver tends to just go along with the gold price. I'm not a silver bug, never have been. Although I would agree with the silver bugs now, which I certainly didn't in years past, that after several years of supply being less than investment and industrial demand, we should finally be seeing the above ground stocks getting fairly small on the silver side. No one's ever really known how big they were. That was kind of where I always parted company with silver bugs in the past. So they'd always go, the production's so much lower than the demand. And at the time there was, probably 1 billion ounces of above ground stock, which you could never get a silver bug to believe, but it was obviously there, because if it wasn't, silver would be $50 right now instead of 16. But I think we are actually getting quite close to the end of those. I find it a little bit unnerving. We're not seeing as more investment demand on the silver side, but I think with the stocks getting to where they should be, and with this pricing not generating any new supply, there really isn't a lot in the pipeline production-wise for silver. I mean, there's lots of guys talking, but there's not that many operations that I think are actually going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. I think we've got a setup where we could actually see the fabled stronger move in the silver price than we get in the gold price. I'll believe it when I see it, but I think we're finally sort of set up to maybe see that happen. Base metals, I don't think it's a big secret which one's my favorite lately. Zinc still has very compelling supply demand, and I don't see that changing. There's a bit of supply coming on stream over the next year and a half, but that should only be enough to meet the increased demand we're going to get from organic growth. Like your basically standard economic growth across the world economy will demand that much supply, so that those 2 or 3 mines that are expanding in the next year and a half aren't likely in and of themselves to decrease the deficit or really add to the warehouse stocks. And we're getting down to that. We've already seen a big move. Obviously, zinc's almost $1.60 a pound, but we're not that far away from I think an inventory level we're certainly close to an inventory level in London. I think what we want to see is the inventories dropping off again in Shanghai. I mean, everybody's focused on the London Metal Exchange, zinc stocks dropping the last 3 months. But at the same time, they were kind of going up at the same amount in Shanghai. So you're actually seeing stuff going from one market to the other. If we see the inventory numbers start falling off in Shanghai at the same time, I think that's probably going to be the signal that we're going to see another leg up. And I do think that we're going to see $2 a pound this cycle, and probably this year actually, quite possibly within the next quarter. It wouldn't surprise me to see a $2 zinc price. I mean, when it goes, it'll happen pretty fast. Copper's similar. There's a little bit of an oversupply this year, not much of one, but there's enough. There's so many labor negotiations this year in the copper space, and with copper prices above $3 a pound, I don't see any particular reason to expect the unions to be overly accommodating. I mean, if I was running one of those copper unions, I wouldn't be overly accommodating. Most of the large mining unions, say in Chile, for instance, there were some concessions last time around, Most of the contracts are 3 years old, and the market wasn't nearly as good 3 years ago. I would think a lot of those unions are going to be a little bit more forceful this time. So I don't think they're going to be crazy, but I do think the odds of, seeing 3 or 4 or 5 mines where there's, 1 week or 2 week strike, that's all it's going to take to wipe out the surplus. I mean, there isn't much of one. So I'm reasonably comfortable we're going to see copper prices stay up in the above $3 level. You do need to watch warehouse inventories though, because this is another one of those metals where there is definitely copper traded for financial reasons, I guess if you want to put it. It gets used as collateral on leveraged loans in China. I mean, there is some of it floating around that way that's not necessarily in bonded warehouses. So sometimes you just kind of see this stuff show up. And you did see that in copper like a couple of months ago. There was like 100,000 tons came out of left field and suddenly it was in the London warehouses. And you do see that occasionally. If you look at a 5-year graph for London Metal Exchange inventories for copper, you'll see a bunch of these spikes like that. It's not that uncommon. But, you do have to recognize there's some of that floating around. But by and large, I don't see the price likely getting below $3 because I think things will be tight enough this year. Zinc, pretty much the same story. Everybody hates zinc. It's poisonous. It's horrible stuff. Blah, 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 blah. Nobody explores for it. There's no one exploring for primary zinc, which is good news if you happen to have a zinc-rich deposit because there's really nothing in the pipeline because nobody's bothered. It's not, long-term, it's one of those metals where it's going to see less usage. I mean, most places have outlawed or are trying to outlaw lead batteries, which is far and away the biggest use of it. But they're still quite legal in what the world's largest market by far, which is China. And I don't see any evidence that market's going to decrease. So I think the lead price will probably be pretty good. It might even be a zinc-like story this year because the inventories are actually getting quite low in zinc compared to the annual sales. The only other metal I'll touch on is uranium. I'd like to tell you that I think the uranium price is going to take off in the near term. I don't. I think it'll happen at some point. Yes, we can all cross our fingers. It will happen at some point. I'm just not sure how soon that's going to be. I mean, I'm just not sold on it being within the next couple of years. Will it happen at some point? Yeah. I've got a feeling it's not going to happen that quickly. And I think if you're a uranium bull, I think you've got to be realistic about the politics of the situation. Somebody coming out with a smaller, cleaner, cheaper reactor would make the entire market's life a great deal easier. It's very hard to permit these things. They're very long lead times. Guys I know that are uranium bull talk to me about the same 50 reactors that they were talking about 10 years ago. It just takes a really, really long time to get through. And there is a lot of above ground stock. That's, much like silver was 5 years ago, there's a lot of above ground uranium. So as much as I'd love to tell you guys that I think the uranium price is going to take off in, 3 months or 6 months or 9 months, I think best case scenario is a couple of years. It's potentially quite a bit longer than that, unfortunately. And on that happy note, we're going to move on directly from there.